spite of some high-profile nuclear scares and disasters, many of the world's scientists, government leaders, and some environmentalists assure us nuclear is a good, clean energy option. For some people, the mere thought of nuclear power makes them extremely nervous. Dr. Trudel is an expert in nuclear power and energy. She is the manager of Environment, Health and Safety at Triumph at UBC, and it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Trudel to Studio 4 to tell us more.
Thank you.
Not a medical doctor, a physicist.
That's correct.
A PhD doctor.
That's correct.
What intrigued you about physics, particularly nuclear physics, in the beginning?
I got introduced to nuclear physics, in fact, with my first summer job that I had at the Tandem Accelerator Laboratory at McMaster University. This was fresh out of my honors physics degree at McGill. It was a fascinating laboratory to work at, a low energy accelerator back 25 years ago. And so you could essentially get your hands on all aspects of doing nuclear physics research. And that's what started it, and I went on from there.
As you know, most of us have not a clue how it works.
Right.
So, I know it's a very complex way to boil water to provide energy or steam, but take me to the beginning.
So so first I should make the distinction between a nuclear reactor, which is where nuclear power comes from, nuclear power plants, and accelerators. So my background and the work that I do currently at Triumph is working with accelerators, where we look to probe the properties of the nucleus of the atom. So if you go back to your early days in science, you would know that inside, at the center of the atom, is a nucleus. And what we do with nuclear power is essentially look to harness the energy from that nucleus. And essentially the comparison between nuclear power and conventional power, fossil fuels, is the difference between harnessing the energy at the center of the atom from the nucleus versus harnessing the energy from the outer part of the atom, that is chemical bonds.
Okay.
So when we're burning fossil fuels, we're essentially breaking chemical bonds. Whereas when we're generating nuclear power, we're breaking the nucleus at the center of the atom. And we get about 100,000 times more energy from breaking that nucleus in the atom than we do from breaking the chemical bonds.
Okay, and how do you break a nucleus? What does it take?
That's right, and that process is called fission. And the way fission happens is you need a heavy nucleus, so we use uranium. And with uranium, because the nucleus is so large, it turns out that just adding one small component to that nucleus, a low energy neutron. So let me just say that the nucleus is made up of protons and neutrons. And if we can generate some low energy neutrons and expose that nucleus to those neutrons, then the nucleus is unstable and it will fission into two equal components, releasing, as I say, 100,000 times more energy than you would if that atom, was just bound and you separated it from its partner.
So it splits essentially?
It splits, so it fissions. That's where. So
it fissions, it splits.
Correct.
Now where does the water fit in?
Well, so all the energy that you generate then, you use to heat up water, and or your primary coolant is heated up, and then you use that primary coolant to generate steam.
Okay, and would the primary coolant always be water, or would it be something else?
In certainly the Canadian reactors, the CANDU reactors, it's actually heavy water. And the reason we do that is because what heavy water is it, as opposed to two hydrogen atoms and an oxygen.
Right.
The hydrogen are heavy hydrogen, if you like. They have an extra neutron, and they're quite stable.
So H4O or H3O?
Actually, a heavy hydrogen is called a deuterium atom, so it's called D2O as opposed to H2O.
D2O.
That's
okay,
correct.
so that's heavy water. See what we're learning?
Yes.
My gosh.
And then of course, the reactors in Japan are boiling water reactors, and there they use just regular water for their primary coolant.
When you heard about the meltdown, the breakdown in Japan, what went through your mind as a physicist?
Of course, it was an evolving situation. And initially we had some releases of hydrogen gas, and that led to the explosion, and some releases of the volatile activity within the reactor. It was still in our minds, and I think remains so still today with the information that we have, a less significant incident than Chernobyl. At Chernobyl, we had a full explosion of the reactor core, which led, in fact, to dispersion of all of the radioactive material, not just the volatile component, way up into the atmosphere, the stratosphere,
right,
and distributed
because
downwind.
of the explosion.
Because of the explosion, that's correct.
And what happened at 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania?
With 3 Mile Island, in fact, we had some release, but very much less than what we've had at Fukushima and at Chernobyl. But what we had at 3 Mile Island is we had a meltdown of the core, as we are now finding out we've had at Fukushima at, I think it's all 4 reactors, to different degrees.
Right.
And again, when I say finding out, that's actually based on simulations that have been done now, based on the evidence that we have so far. Ultimately, when things cool down enough, we'll be looking to get some cameras in there to be able to look at the status of the cores.
Okay, so what makes the core so hot?
So the core, so let me explain that the core...
We're still back at splitting the nucleus. We haven't quite gotten there.
That's correct.
Okay.
The core is contained in a pressure vessel, and so that's your nuclear fuel and your coolant in that pressure vessel. Now, of course, the coolant has to come out of the pressure vessel to generate the steam and turn the turbines. But the heat in the core comes essentially from the heat from the fissioning uranium.
Okay.
And when you turn off the reactor, what you do is you insert control rods that essentially soak up the neutrons, which are those low energy neutrons that I said were the beginning of the fission reaction.
And are those called fuel rods or just rods?
The fuel is contained in fuel rods, and then the control rods are an absorbing material, usually made of boron-loaded graphite, a substance that soaks up neutrons. In order to, in fact, it's like putting the brakes on your car, essentially to put the brakes on the fission reaction.
So that's the control part.
That's correct.
What is radioactive in all of this?
Well, the radioactive components are, in fact, those fission products that I mentioned initially.
And where does all that go? Because I know one of the big controversies for people who don't know much about it, and that would be me,
Sure.
is what are we doing with the waste, and where are we storing the radioactive waste and the spent fuel? What happens to it? I was reading an article that there are actually pools in some U.S. plants where the spent fuel is held temporarily, and if we had a giant quake in one of those places, all that would be dispersed. True, not true?
I think certainly that the nuclear industry is reviewing the whole status with spent fuel pools. But I think the process with the fuel is that it needs to go into a temporary storage to allow that initial decay of and the release of the heat from the decay.
Right.
So you need active cooling.
Does that take years?
And that takes years. That takes 3 to 4 years. I'm not an expert in reactor nuclear power plants, but my understanding it's several years. And then probably on a time scale of maybe 5 to 10 years after that, then one would look to process that waste, package it in a substrate to essentially neutralize it, to keep it from reacting with any elements, and then put it into deep underground storage. That's one of the proposals that's being looked at by the Canadian
So once
industry.
the fuel is spent, what to do with it is still a question, always a question.
It is always a question, certainly, but we've certainly, the Canadian scientists have done a lot of work, and the international, other countries as well have done a lot of work in terms of understanding the properties and the long-term properties of storing that waste. And we're now in a position where we understand enough that we can look to begin down that road, because it's something we have to address regardless of whether we keep going with nuclear or not. We've got this spent fuel from the last 30 years that we need
and as
to
you know,
deal with.
Germany, France are looking at their plants, and their plants that aren't so modern, taking a second look, a third look.
That's correct, yeah.
Post Japan.
That's correct, yeah. I mean, I think France is heavily invested in nuclear power, and I don't see them certainly moving away from it. I know Germany has made some decisions recently to move away from nuclear, though it isn't clear how they're going to make up the balance of the power that they need to generate.
Well, that's the other question. How difficult would it be to move away? And if they do move away, what do they replace it with? Wind, geothermal?
That's correct.
Fossil fuels?
Right. And certainly we have a long way to go in terms of the renewable resources to be able to generate comparable levels of energy that we do with fossil fuel and nuclear. And of course, the downside to fossil fuel is how do you meet your CO2 emission targets that you're looking to meet in terms of addressing global warming. So, getting back to what I said originally at the beginning with regard to the fact that you're getting 100,000 times more energy from that single atom through nuclear power than you do through conventional fuels or fossil fuels. It's by that same token that you have 100,000 times less matter, less waste to deal with. And that's what makes nuclear so green, and that's why you see that statement being made in terms of nuclear power.
Sure, because as you know, some environmentalists are on side with nuclear power, others are totally against it, and we're sort of a greatest hope, greatest fear. Our greatest hope is we can find clean energy, and our greatest fear is we will find clean energy that affects us and kills us, so what to do? We'll come back with Dr. Ann Trudel.